Welcome. Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength by Roy F. Baumeister and John Tierney. In a world defined by endless distractions, constant temptations, and the subtle exhaustion of daily decisions, self-control remains the ultimate cornerstone of human success and fulfillment. This audio experience goes far beyond a simple summary. It is designed to immerse you in the profound psychological depths and philosophical weight of the original text. We will explore the hidden biological engines that fuel our resolve, the invisible forces that drain our focus, and the practical wisdom required to reclaim the greatest human strength. Prepare to rediscover the true nature of your own willpower. Chapter 1. Is willpower more than a metaphor? The image of a fiercely disciplined individual rarely conjures up someone like Amanda Palmer. Known for her provocative gender-bending performances and her chaotic Dionysian public persona, Palmer seems to embody the absolute rejection of Victorian repression. When she accepted a marriage proposal from a famous novelist, she announced it to the world by casually admitting she might have been drunk at the time. Yet beneath this carefully cultivated exterior of wild abandon lies a reservoir of profound self-control. Long before she was selling out concert halls, Palmer spent 6 grueling years practicing what she considers the ultimate Zen discipline, working as a living statue. Draped in a wedding dress, her face painted stark white, she would stand on a box in the middle of Harvard Square entirely motionless. The physical demands of simply standing were secondary to the immense psychological burden of non-reactivity. She had to suppress every natural human reflex. When intoxicated pedestrians harassed her, when tourists tried to provoke a laugh, or when a mosquito settled on her cheek, she could not flinch. She let the world pass through her without a single twitch of response. Although she barely moved a muscle, a few hours on that pedestal left her in a state of absolute staggering exhaustion. She would return home barely alive, her brain entirely blank. The question that lingered was profound. Why should doing absolutely nothing drain a person of so much energy? Palmer was exercising what 19th century thinkers would have confidently called willpower, but modern science had long ago dismissed that concept as a mere metaphor. How could an invisible mental effort exact such a heavy physical toll? The Radish experiment. The answer to that mystery began to unfold in a laboratory filled with the irresistible aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. In a mildly cruel but highly revealing experiment, researchers brought in college students who had deliberately skipped a meal. Upon arriving, they were seated at a table displaying the warm, fragrant cookies, an assortment of chocolates, and a bowl of raw radishes. Some fortunate subjects were invited to indulge in the sweets. The unlucky ones were instructed to eat only the radishes. Left alone with the forbidden treats, the radish eaters visibly struggled. They stared at the cookies, occasionally picked them up to inhale the scent of melted chocolate, but they managed to resist taking a bite. The true test, however, came next. The students were moved to another room and given geometry puzzles to solve. Unbeknownst to them, the puzzles were rigged to be mathematically impossible. The researchers simply wanted to measure their perseverance. The students who had been allowed to eat the cookies, along with a control group who had not been tempted by food at all, typically worked at the frustrating task for about 20 minutes before giving up. But the radish eaters, those who had just waged a silent internal war against the temptation of chocolate, surrendered in a mere 8 minutes. They had successfully defended their resolve in the first trial, but the effort had drained them. This dramatic collapse shattered modern psychological assumptions and resurrected an ancient wisdom. Willpower was not just a metaphor. It behaved exactly like a muscle. When used, it became fatigued. This changeful potency of human resolve, recognized centuries ago by Shakespeare in his tragedies, was now observable in a laboratory. It perfectly explained the struggles of everyday life. Marital therapists, for example, had long noted that couples engaged in the most trivial, destructive arguments after long days at the office. The partners were simply running on empty. They had surrendered all their mental energy to the demands of their jobs, leaving them with no reserves to tolerate a spouse's minor annoyances or to suppress a sarcastic remark. Further experiments confirmed that this exhaustion extended to every form of self-regulation. Subjects asked to hold their hands in painfully cold water or to squeeze a hand grip exerciser quit much faster if their minds were already fatigued. Even the act of managing emotions carried a heavy cost. In one study, participants watched a heartbreaking documentary about dying wildlife. Some were told to completely suppress their emotional reactions, remaining stoic, while others were instructed to amplify their feelings and let the tears flow. A third group watched normally. Afterward, those who had to manage their emotions, whether by stifling them or forcing them, demonstrated significantly less physical stamina on subsequent tests. Faking a response, or burying one, was not free. The mind's attempt to control its own wandering thoughts proved equally draining. Inspired by a legendary challenge involving the young Tolstoy, researchers asked subjects to spend 5 minutes completely suppressing any thought of a white bear. When people actively fought off the image of the white bear, they were left so depleted that they performed worse on later puzzles and entirely failed to suppress their laughter when forced to watch a comedy routine with a straight face. The energy required to silence an unwanted thought was the exact same energy needed to persevere through a difficult task or to maintain a dignified composure. Name that feeling. As the evidence mounted, the scientific community faced a new dilemma. What exactly should this phenomenon be called? To find a theoretical framework that treated the self as a system fueled by energy, researchers had to reach all the way back to Sigmund Freud. Freud had speculated that humans channel instinctual energy into various behaviors, a concept that had been largely abandoned. While Freud's specific mechanisms were flawed, his fundamental intuition that the self operates on an economy of energy was brilliantly prescient. In a nod to that legacy, the phenomenon of exhausted resolve was named ego depletion. The invisible mechanics of ego depletion were eventually illuminated by neuroscientists mapping the electrical activity of the brain. When subjects whose willpower had been drained by emotional suppression were hooked up to monitors and asked to perform cognitive tests, the researchers observed a distinct sluggishness in the anterior cingulate cortex. This region acts as the brain's alarm system, detecting conflicts and errors, like the sudden realization that you're about to bite into your phone instead of your sandwich. When the ego is depleted, this alarm system falters. The brain slows down, and the ability to catch mistakes or override immediate impulses severely deteriorates. Yet, despite this measurable biological slowdown, ego depletion is an incredibly deceptive condition because it does not feel like exhaustion. For years, researchers searched for a specific emotional symptom, a signature mood of sadness or anger, that would warn a person their willpower was running low. They found none. Instead, they discovered something far more dangerous. Ego depletion does not create a specific feeling, it intensifies all of them. A depleted mind reacts to the world with magnified sensitivity. A sad movie becomes devastatingly tragic. Cold water feels agonizingly painful. A mild frustration provokes explosive rage. Crucially, desires are also amplified. A depleted person does not just lack the strength to resist a cookie. The craving for that cookie actually feels stronger. This creates a devastating double bind, particularly for those fighting serious addictions. The intense effort required to resist a drug during withdrawal causes massive ego depletion, which in turn magnifies the craving for the drug and makes every daily stressor feel insurmountable. The mystery of the dirty socks. The sprawling, messy consequences of this depletion were perhaps best illustrated by an old joke among university professors, who noticed that students during final exams could either finish their term papers or remember to change their socks, but rarely both. Decades later, psychologists confirmed that this was no joke. By testing students throughout the semester, researchers mapped a complete collapse of personal habits during the high-stress period of finals. As the students poured their willpower into studying, every other area of their lives fell into ruin. They abandoned their exercise routines, they doubled their caffeine intake and smoked far more cigarettes. Despite having fewer social events to attend, they drank just as much alcohol. They stopped eating healthy meals, substituting them with junk food. And, just as the joke predicted, their personal hygiene plummeted. They skipped showers, forgot to brush their teeth, and wore unwashed clothes. This sweeping deterioration wasn't a conscious, practical decision to save time for studying. In fact, despite their best intentions, many students actually ended up studying less during finals, squandering their time socializing or sleeping in. They had simply burned through their capacity to regulate their own behavior. The same pattern appeared in a massive study tracking adults throughout their daily lives. The more temptations a person resisted earlier in the day, the more likely they were to cave in to whatever urge crossed their path next. However, the mind is not entirely defenseless. It has a subtle instinct for preservation. In experiments where subjects were warned that multiple grueling tasks lay ahead, they unconsciously held back their effort on the initial challenges, hoarding their mental energy for the final push. When researchers introduced surprise cash rewards, the depleted subjects suddenly tapped into hidden, emergency reserves, much like a tired runner finding a second wind at the sight of the finish line. But if those runners were then tricked, if they were forced into yet another trial they hadn't conserved energy for, their performance collapsed entirely. The well had truly run dry. Lessons from the street and the lab. Even Amanda Palmer, who rejects the label of a disciplined person, acknowledges that those agonizing hours frozen on a milk crate in Harvard Square gave her an unbreakable mental focus. Her intuition aligns perfectly with the two great truths uncovered by the laboratories. First, human willpower is a finite resource that drains with use. Second, we draw from the exact same well of energy for wildly different tasks. The discipline it takes to ignore a plate of donuts is drawn from the same account you need to navigate rush-hour traffic or to feign interest in a tedious meeting. This single reserve of strength governs four distinct arenas of human life. First is the control of thoughts, allowing us to filter out distractions and lock our focus on a singular goal. Second is the regulation of emotions, the difficult art of escaping a dark mood or restraining a burst of anger. Third is impulse control, the classic battle against the sudden temptations of substance, sloth, or desire. Finally, there is performance control, the quiet endurance required to pace ourselves, manage our time, and refuse to quit when our muscles and minds scream for rest. Understanding this biological reality offers a profound strategic advantage. The most common mistake people make is to declare war on multiple fronts simultaneously. The tradition of drafting a long list of New Year's resolutions, vowing to quit smoking, hit the gym, save money, and be a better spouse all at once, is mathematically doomed to fail. Each time you succeed in one area, you bankrupt your capacity to succeed in the others. The true secret to transformation is to honor the limits of your own biology. Focus your energy on a single, solitary battle. Change one behavior at a time. It requires immense patience, but as the living statue on the pedestal discovered amidst the chaos of the street, human beings are capable of astonishing endurance if they simply gather their strength and decide, unequivocally, not to move. Chapter 2. Where does the power in willpower come from? The search for the biological source of willpower led researchers away from abstract theories of character and into the realm of basic human physiology. If the will is indeed a muscle, capable of fatigue, strengthening, and depletion, then it must require a physical fuel to operate. The quest to identify this fuel eventually converged on a simple, vital substance: glucose. The brain is the most energy-hungry organ in the human body. Despite representing only a small fraction of our total weight, it consumes approximately 20% of our daily caloric intake. This massive metabolic demand is primarily dedicated to the intricate, energy-intensive processes of the prefrontal cortex, the exact region responsible for self-control, complex planning, and the inhibition of impulses. It stands to reason, then, that when glucose levels in the bloodstream fluctuate, our capacity for discipline must shift in tandem. In a series of classic laboratory trials, researchers observed that individuals who had been mentally drained by complex tasks showed a marked decline in blood glucose levels. More tellingly, when those same exhausted individuals were provided with a glass of lemonade sweetened with real sugar, their self-control returned almost instantaneously. In contrast, those given a placebo drink, sweetened with a zero-calorie artificial sweetener, remained in a state of ego depletion, their resolve as fragile as before. This effect was not due to the pleasant taste or the expectation of reward. It was a direct physiological replenishment of the brain's primary energy source. This discovery clarified why self-control often falters under stress, during illness, or when we are physically hungry. When the body faces a crisis, It prioritizes the maintenance of essential survival functions, the regulation of body temperature, and the operation of the heart and lungs, over the expensive, luxurious cognitive labor of the prefrontal cortex. In times of physiological scarcity, the brain effectively pulls the plug on our higher-order willpower to ensure that the vital organs remain fueled. However, the relationship between glucose and willpower is not a simple fill-up-the-tank equation. It is a nuanced system of regulation. The brain is remarkably adept at detecting dips in blood sugar before they become dangerous, often signaling an impending shortage through feelings of irritability or increased impulsivity. We feel these internal shifts as a sudden, intense craving for immediate gratification. When we reach for a sugary snack in the middle of a difficult afternoon, we are not merely succumbing to a weakness of character. Our bodies are signaling a desperate physiological need for the fuel required to continue the work of self-regulation. This biological insight fundamentally changes how we must approach the management of our own behavior. It suggests that the greatest human strength is ultimately tethered to the quality of the fuel we provide our bodies. Diets that cause rapid spikes and crashes in blood sugar, characterized by high glycemic processed carbohydrates, are effectively booby traps for our self-control. They offer an initial fleeting burst of energy followed by a prolonged, deeper exhaustion that leaves us entirely defenseless against our worst impulses. Conversely, foods that provide a slow, steady release of energy, complex carbohydrates, proteins, and healthy fats, act as a long-term investment in our own resolve. Beyond the intake of food, the body also possesses an internal mechanism for managing its energy reserves. The liver acts as a critical secondary storehouse, releasing glucose into the bloodstream during periods of intense effort. Yet this system is not infinite. Chronic, unremitting stress acts as a constant drain, forcing the body to dump these reserves into the system to handle the perceived threat, leaving little left over for the daily, deliberate acts of discipline we strive to maintain. Ultimately, understanding the biological engine of willpower removes the shame often associated with its failure. It reframes the struggle for self-control not as a battle of moral worth, but as a sophisticated exercise in biological management. We are not weak-willed, we are energy-constrained. By monitoring our physical states, respecting the physiological limits of our focus, and choosing the right fuel, we can stop fighting our biology and start working with it. The secret is not to demand more from ourselves when we are empty, but to learn the rhythm of our own energy, ensuring that we have the resources to exert our will exactly when it matters most. Chapter 3. A Brief History of the To-Do List, From God to Drew Carey. The human obsession with managing time and behavior through lists is as ancient as recorded history itself. From the stone-etched mandates of divine law to the modern digital app, the to-do list represents a quintessential human attempt to externalize willpower. When we realize that our own mental reserves are finite and unreliable, we instinctively reach for tools to impose order upon our impulses. This transition, from relying on internal discipline to creating external scaffolding, marks a defining feature of modern existence. History reveals that the most effective leaders and thinkers rarely trusted their unaided minds to govern their actions. Instead, they recognized that the ego is easily distracted and quick to negotiate with itself. By committing goals to paper, they transformed vague intentions into concrete obligations. This act of documentation serves a dual purpose. It clears the mental clutter, reducing the anxiety of trying to remember every task, and it creates a psychological commitment contract that makes abandonment significantly harder. However, the history of the to-do list also cautions us against the trap of over-ambition. We often curate our lists with a dangerous optimism, ignoring the inevitable reality of our own ego depletion. We draft schedules that assume a superhuman capacity for sustained focus, failing to account for the physiological dips in energy that strike throughout the day. When we inevitably fail to clear our overloaded lists, the resulting frustration does not just ruin the day, it depletes our remaining willpower, making us more susceptible to procrastination and poor decision-making. The true efficacy of the to-do list is deeply rooted in what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect. Our brains are wired to hold on to unfinished tasks with a nagging, intrusive persistence. We feel a psychological itch for closure, a tension that demands to be resolved. This is why a simple, well-structured list is so transformative. It grants the mind permission to let go. Once a task is safely recorded, the brain can disengage from the loop of ruminative memory, freeing up its precious energy for the actual work of completion. In our contemporary landscape, this practice has been revolutionized and complicated by an endless parade of productivity tools. From the high-minded systems of time management gurus to the quick-fix apps on our smartphones, the temptation to focus on the tool rather than the goal is immense. We spend hours refining our organizational systems, confusing the appearance of productivity with the reality of accomplishment. The most successful individuals, however, understand a fundamental truth. The best to-do list is not the one with the most sophisticated features. It is the one that forces you to confront your true priorities and accept your realistic limits. Ultimately, the lesson from history is not to seek the perfect, all-encompassing system, but to cultivate a balanced relationship with our own limitations. We must learn to distinguish between the truly vital goals and the seductive low-value tasks that merely fill our time. By narrowing our focus, we protect our mental reserves from being scattered across a dozen different fronts. The most profound power of the to-do list lies not in its ability to track everything we want to do, but in its ability to reveal the few things we absolutely must do, ensuring that when we apply our willpower, we do so with maximum impact and minimum waste. Chapter 4. Decision Fatigue. The most profound realization in the study of willpower is that our capacity for self-regulation is not just drained by emotional labor or physical temptation. It is also depleted by the mundane, constant necessity of choice. Every time we weigh options, deliberate on a preference, or deliberate between alternatives, we consume a portion of our limited mental fuel. This phenomenon is known as decision fatigue, and it is the invisible force shaping the quality of our lives. The gravity of this finding is best illustrated by observing those who make choices for a living. Consider, for example, the results of a study tracking parole judges. These professionals, tasked with the heavy responsibility of deciding whether prisoners are granted freedom, are trained to be objective and consistent. Yet when researchers analyzed over 1,000 rulings, a stark pattern emerged. Parole decisions were significantly influenced by the timing of the judge's last meal. Prisoners appearing first thing in the morning or immediately after a lunch break enjoyed a much higher probability of being granted parole. As the morning progressed, or as the afternoon stretched on, the likelihood of a favorable ruling plummeted, often reaching zero. The judges were not acting out of malice or prejudice. They were experiencing the raw physiological effects of decision fatigue. The mental effort required to adjudicate complex cases is immense, and as their glucose reserves diminished, their brains reflexively shifted toward the path of least resistance, maintaining the status quo. Denying parole is the safest, most effortless choice for a tired mind. It avoids the risk of releasing someone who might recidivate and requires no further deliberation. It is the default, the safe option for an ego that no longer has the energy to pass the nuances of a prisoner's case. This same cycle repeats in every facet of our daily existence. The morning is often our time of greatest clarity because our mental reserves are full. We make our most difficult decisions, those regarding work, finance, or complex problem-solving, with a sharpness that evaporates as the day wears on. By evening, our capacity for complex deliberation is so compromised that we become prone to impulsive purchasing, poor dietary choices, and unnecessary arguments. This is why the most sophisticated marketing strategies target us in the late hours. They understand that a fatigued mind is far less likely to resist the temptation of an impulse buy. The toll of decision fatigue extends beyond mere mistakes. It leads to a state of profound paralysis. When we are faced with an overwhelming array of choices, whether in the supermarket aisle or in the digital landscape, our brains struggle to process the surplus. We often default to avoiding the decision altogether, or we gravitate toward the simplest, most familiar option to conserve our dwindling energy. This is the tyranny of choice, a condition where the abundance of alternatives actually diminishes our autonomy rather than enhancing it. To counter this, the most successful individuals adopt a strategy of simplification. They recognize that their willpower is a finite resource to be guarded, not wasted on trivialities. By automating the small recurring decisions of life, establishing rigid routines for meals, clothing, and daily habits, they eliminate the need to expend mental energy on unimportant matters. This is not a life of drab uniformity, but a strategic deployment of energy. By removing the friction of unnecessary choice, we preserve our decision-making power for the moments when it truly counts, ensuring that we bring our best selves to the decisions that define our future. Continue. Chapter 5. Where have all the dollars gone? If we were to map the terrain of human willpower, we would find that the most treacherous peaks and valleys are not merely physical or emotional, they are financial. The way we handle money is perhaps the most visible, objective ledger of our self-control. Every purchase, every investment, and every impulse buy serves as a heartbeat monitor for our internal capacity to delay gratification. Yet, we frequently stumble into the trap of believing that our financial decisions are purely rational, logical assessments of value. In reality, they are almost entirely governed by the same finite, depletable reserves that dictate our ability to resist a dessert or ignore a distraction. When the ego is depleted, our financial boundaries dissolve. It is no coincidence that the most aggressive consumer environments are designed to exploit this precise moment of exhaustion. The checkout lane, filled with trivial items, isn't just a place to pay. It is a tactical zone where retailers capture the shopper whose willpower has been eroded by the long, taxing process of navigating the store. By the time we arrive at the register, our capacity to say no has been significantly diminished, making us susceptible to the final low-cost impulse additions that inflate the total bill. The phenomenon of debt fueling is essentially the physical manifestation of ego depletion. Credit cards, in their design, remove the immediate visceral pain of payment. By delaying the sting of parting with our money, they bypass the brain's natural stop signal, allowing us to spend in a state of diminished awareness. When our willpower is low, when we are stressed, tired, or overwhelmed, the psychological barrier to accruing debt lowers dramatically. We stop viewing the purchase as a subtraction from our future security and instead see it as a necessary balm for our current state of fatigue. This financial struggle is worsened by the scarcity mindset. When we feel that money is tight, our focus narrows to the immediate crisis. We lose the ability to perform long-term fiscal planning because all our mental energy is consumed by the pressing, short-term need to survive. Ironically, this focus on the immediate often leads to long-term decisions that are profoundly self-defeating, such as high-interest borrowing or neglecting maintenance on essential assets, which then create even larger crises down the road. To reclaim control over our financial lives, we must move beyond the ineffective strategy of constant daily vigilance. We cannot expect our willpower to act as a permanent guard dog over our bank accounts, especially when we are tired or busy. The most successful approach is the establishment of pre-commitment devices. These are the structural safeguards we build into our lives when our resolve is high, which then protect us automatically when our resolve is low. Examples of these devices include the automatic transfer of savings, which whisks money into an inaccessible account before we have the chance to spend it, or the deliberate decision to carry only cash, which provides a vivid, sensory warning of exactly how much wealth is being consumed. By creating systems that function without our constant active oversight, we protect our precious mental reserves. We ensure that our financial trajectory is governed by the calm, rational plans we made in our strongest moments, rather than the impulsive, tired decisions we are prone to make in our weakest. Chapter 6. Can willpower be strengthened? If willpower operates like a muscle, then it follows that the most critical question is not just how to conserve it, but how to build it. For generations, the prevailing psychological view was that self-control was a fixed, innate quantity, a trait you were either born with or forever lacked. This belief fostered a sense of helplessness. If your resolve was weak, you were simply destined to remain at the mercy of your impulses. Modern research, however, has decisively overturned this fatalism. We now know that willpower is not a static endowment, but a dynamic, malleable capacity that can be systematically strengthened through consistent, intentional exercise. The secret to building this strength lies in the principle of self-regulatory fatigue, handled in reverse. Just as lifting weights creates micro-tears in muscle fibers that heal back stronger, the act of exerting self-control creates a strengthening effect. When individuals commit to a regular regimen of self-regulation, even in areas entirely unrelated to their primary goal, they experience a spillover effect that elevates their overall willpower. This is the phenomenon of cross-domain transfer. The discipline learned on one battlefield strengthens your resolve on all others. The most effective way to begin this process is through the cultivation of habitual behaviors. When we transform a conscious, effortful act into an automatic, subconscious routine, we effectively offload the burden from our finite willpower reserves. Initially, the process requires an intense expenditure of energy, the deliberate focus needed to adopt a new exercise habit, maintain a tidier workspace, or monitor one's posture. But as the behavior becomes ingrained, the cognitive cost drops towards zero. This is not just about adopting a new habit, it is about the act of training itself, proving to your own mind that you have the authority to override your initial impulses. This training must be approached with the same pragmatism one uses for physical athletics. Attempting to overhaul your entire life at once is the psychological equivalent of a person who has never exercised suddenly attempting a marathon. They will inevitably collapse under the strain. Instead, the path to stronger resolve requires a progressive overload approach. Begin with small, manageable adjustments to your daily life, perhaps committing to a specific minor task that you find slightly irritating, and maintain that commitment with absolute, unwavering consistency. It is crucial to recognize that this strengthening process is not a linear climb to perfection. There will be days of inevitable relapse where the ego is depleted and old impulses resurface with unexpected force. The goal of willpower training is not to eliminate these moments, but to decrease their frequency and duration. Every time you consciously choose to adhere to your regimen despite a lack of motivation, you are physically rewiring the connections in your prefrontal cortex, reinforcing the brain's alarm system, and expanding the total capacity of your mental reservoir. Ultimately, this is the most empowering truth in the science of self-regulation. You are the architect of your own character. You are not a prisoner of your biology, but a participant in its development. By viewing your daily life as a training ground, you can transform the mundane challenges of existence into the very instruments of your growth. Over time, these small, deliberate acts of self-control accumulate, creating a robust, resilient version of the self that can withstand the pressures of a complex world with increasing ease. The capacity for greatness is not something you find, it is something you build, one disciplined choice at a time.
Chapter 7. Outsmarting Yourself in the Heart of Darkness. The most sophisticated application of willpower is not found in the brute force of resistance, but in the strategic design of our own environments. We are all prone to the siren song of temptation, those moments when our resolve falters and our biological impulses override our rational intentions. To rely solely on internal strength in these moments is a tactical error. The truly resilient individual understands that it is far more effective to change the environment than to attempt to change the self under fire. This is the art of outsmarting oneself. The most potent strategy is the implementation of if-then plans, a method that delegates the heavy lifting of decision-making to the subconscious mind. By pre-deciding exactly how to react to specific triggers. If I feel the urge to check my phone during deep work, then I will take 3 deep breaths and return to the task. We bypass the need for conscious, effortful deliberation in the moment of temptation. We convert a potential crisis of willpower into a simple, automated routine. This approach is particularly vital when navigating what could be called the heart of darkness, the moments or environments where our self-control is most severely tested. This might be the late-night hours when exhaustion is at its peak, a specific social setting that encourages overindulgence, or a recurring professional stressor that triggers a cycle of procrastination. Rather than relying on willpower to win in these situations, the goal is to design them out of existence. We must also be wary of the "what the hell" effect, a classic psychological trap where a single minor lapse in self-control leads to a total collapse of discipline. When we succumb to a small temptation, we often convince ourselves that the entire day is ruined, and consequently we surrender entirely to our impulses. To outsmart ourselves, we must plan for these lapses. We must recognize that perfect adherence is an unrealistic, destructive standard, and instead foster a mindset that views a slip-up as a data point rather than a defeat. The goal is to minimize the damage and immediately re-engage with our plans, preventing a small mistake from cascading into a systemic failure. Furthermore, the most successful individuals leverage the power of external accountability. We are social animals, and we are significantly more likely to honor our commitments when they are visible to others. By publicizing our goals, joining groups with shared intentions, or employing mentors and coaches,
we create a social structure that supports our resolve. This isn't a sign of weakness, it is a recognition of the social nature of the human brain. We are hardwired to value reputation and social integration, and we can utilize this drive to bolster our internal discipline. Ultimately, outsmarting yourself is about moving from a reactive state to a proactive design. It is the acknowledgement that willpower is not an infinite fountain, but a finite energy source that must be managed with wisdom. By creating environments that make the right choice the easy choice, by automating our responses to common triggers, and by embracing the social support necessary to stay the course, we can protect our resolve. We stop fighting against our own nature and begin to curate a life where our environment acts as a partner in our success, rather than an adversary in our struggle.
Chapter 8. Did a higher power help Eric Clapton and Mary Carr stop drinking? The journey toward sobriety is often marked by the profound transformative influence of spiritual intervention. For figures like Eric Clapton and the memoirist Mary Carr, the path out of the abyss of addiction was not merely a matter of cold, calculated willpower. It was a surrender to a force perceived as larger than the self. When we examine these testimonies through the lens of psychology, we find a fascinating intersection between the ancient wisdom of spiritual surrender and the modern mechanics of self-regulation. The 12-step model, famously pioneered by Alcoholics Anonymous, operates on a principle that seems, at first glance, to contradict the necessity of individual effort. By explicitly calling for the acknowledgement of a higher power, these programs encourage the individual to step back from the exhausting, often futile attempt to manage their own desires through sheer brute force. In psychological terms, this is a masterful strategy of willpower offloading. Addicts struggling with substances are constantly depleted by the internal battle to suppress their urges. By surrendering the outcome to a higher authority, whether that be a deity, a community, or a collective principle, they effectively relieve their prefrontal cortex of the constant, agonizing duty of decision-making. This surrender creates a vital psychological space. When a person no longer views themselves as the sole arbiter and guardian of their own restraint, the frantic, ego-depleting monitoring of their own behavior ceases. They are no longer constantly checking their own resolve. They are trusting in a framework that has been proven effective for others. This trust acts as a surrogate for self-control, providing the stability needed for the biological engine to recover. The higher power becomes the external anchor that holds the individual steady while their own internal resources are replenished. Moreover, the spiritual community provides the essential social support that acts as a guardrail against ego depletion. By surrounding themselves with peers who share the same commitment, individuals in recovery are rarely forced to stand alone against their triggers. The social pressure, the shared rituals, and the collective wisdom of the group serve as a constant external source of discipline. The group carries the burden of willpower that the individual, in their weakened state, cannot yet sustain alone. This is not to say that willpower is irrelevant in spiritual recovery. Rather, it is redefined. It is not the willpower of the lone, struggling hero, but the willpower of the committed participant. It takes profound resolve to attend meetings, to be honest about one's failures, and to accept the vulnerability of dependence on others. The individual is still active, still choosing, and still exerting discipline, but they are doing so within a structure that minimizes the cost of that effort. Ultimately, the stories of Clapton and Carr highlight that the capacity for self-regulation is often maximized when we reach the limits of our own ego. We are designed to flourish in connection with others and in harmony with systems that transcend our limited individual perspectives. When the weight of our own choices becomes unbearable, the most courageous act is to stop attempting to be the master of our own fate and to seek the support, spiritual or social, that allows us to endure. In surrendering our perceived autonomy, we often find the very strength we were searching for all along. Chapter 9. Raising Strong Children, Self-Esteem versus Self-Control. For decades, the prevailing philosophy of child-rearing in the Western world was built upon the bedrock of self-esteem. We were told that a child's path to success was paved with constant unconditional praise, that if we simply bolstered a child's sense of self-worth, achievement and happiness would naturally follow.
We handed out ribbons for participation, showered praise upon every mundane effort, and guarded against any experience that might cause a moment of discouragement or doubt. Yet, as the generations raised under this paradigm matured, we discovered a disquieting truth. Self-esteem is not a cause of success, it is a byproduct. When we focus exclusively on building a child's ego, we often inadvertently rob them of the very strength they need to thrive, the capacity for self-control. The most effective approach to parenting, as revealed by years of behavioral research, is not the pursuit of fragile confidence, but the steady, consistent cultivation of discipline. The goal is not to protect children from the frustrations of life, but to prepare them to navigate those frustrations with resolve. This means allowing them to face consequences, to struggle with challenging tasks, and to experience the natural, non-catastrophic failures that serve as the essential crucible for character development. A child who is taught that they can endure discomfort, that they can regulate their own impulses, and that their focus is a tool they command, is far more prepared for the rigors of adulthood than one who has been sheltered in a bubble of superficial validation. This training does not require the harsh authoritarian rigidity of the past. Instead, it requires a calm, consistent structure. Children crave limits, not because they enjoy restriction, but because they intuitively understand that a world without boundaries is unpredictable and chaotic. By providing clear, stable expectations, what is required, what is forbidden, and what the consequences of their actions will be, we create a psychological environment where their prefrontal cortex can develop the muscle of self-regulation. We are not just setting rules, we are teaching them the meta-skill of self-mastery. Crucially, the most powerful influence in this process is parental modeling. Children are observant, intuitive students of their parents' daily lives. They watch how we handle our own frustrations, how we respond when we are tired, and whether we hold ourselves to the standards we demand of them. If we preach the value of self-discipline while we ourselves succumb to constant, undisciplined impulses, our messages will inevitably fall flat. To raise strong children, we must first embody the strength we wish them to possess. We must show them that an adult life, too, is a life of continuous, intentional regulation. As children grow, the focus of this training should shift toward autonomy. We move from being the external directors of their behavior to the supportive observers of their internal development. We give them the tools to manage their own time, to monitor their own impulses, and to understand the biological rhythm of their own energy. This is a profound gift. By fostering self-control over self-esteem, we are not denying them happiness. We are ensuring that their happiness is earned, sustained, and deeply rooted in a sense of agency that no hardship can easily strip away. We are raising individuals who do not look to the world for their worth, but who look within themselves to find the strength to face the world. Chapter 10. The Perfect Storm of Dieting. The quest for the ideal body shape has become the modern battlefield for human willpower, yet it is a war that seems fundamentally designed for failure. Dieting is not merely a challenge of resisting the urge to eat, it is a perfect storm that targets every known vulnerability of the human self-regulation system. It is a collision of biological deprivation, emotional stress, and the relentless decision fatigue of constant food monitoring, creating a scenario where even the strongest willpower is inevitably ground down. At the heart of the failure of most diets is the body's innate, evolutionary defense mechanism against starvation. When we drastically reduce caloric intake, the body does not interpret this as a choice for health. It perceives a crisis of survival. It responds by slowing the metabolism and amplifying hunger signals, creating a physiological counterattack against our resolve. We are fighting against millions of years of evolutionary programming that screams for us to consume energy whenever it is available. To win this battle, we aren't just resisting a cookie, we are resisting a biological alarm system that perceives our diet as a life-threatening emergency. This physiological pressure is compounded by the mental exhaustion of food monitoring. Most diets require an immense, constant expenditure of willpower. Every meal becomes a decision, every social gathering becomes a test, and every snack becomes a choice that must be meticulously evaluated. This is the definition of decision fatigue. By making food a focus of constant cognitive labor, we deplete the very resource we need to resist the temptation. We start the day with the resolve to stay on track, but by the evening, after a day of managing our diet, our willpower is fully bankrupt. This is why the evening snack is the undoing of so many. Our ego is too exhausted to maintain the wall of discipline we built in the morning. Furthermore, dieting often triggers the what the hell effect in its most acute form. Because we define our success in binary terms, we are either on the diet or off the diet. A single minor lapse feels like a total catastrophe. When a dieter eats a slice of cake, they don't see it as a small, manageable error. They perceive it as the end of their efforts. In that moment of perceived failure, they often conclude that since the day is already ruined, they might as well binge. This binary thinking is the dieter's most lethal enemy, as it turns every small slip into a total collapse of self-regulation. To escape this cycle, the most effective approach is to move away from the model of dieting as a period of intense, effortful restriction. Instead, we must focus on creating a sustainable lifestyle of habits that minimize the need for active willpower. This means choosing foods that stabilize blood sugar levels, thereby preventing the physiological dips that trigger cravings, and automating our eating patterns to reduce the number of daily decisions. The successful approach isn't about using willpower to beat the body into submission. It is about working with the body to manage energy effectively. It is about shifting the focus from what I cannot eat to how can I design my life so that I don't feel the need to eat in a way that sabotages my goals. By removing the mental burden of dieting and replacing it with consistent, lower-effort habits, we stop fighting the perfect storm and start navigating our health with a calm, enduring resolve.